The leather jacket was still smoking when Detective Marcus Hawthorne kicked down the front door. Blood dripped from Sarah Mitchell's split lip as she shielded her 8-year-old daughter behind the kitchen counter. Outside, 3 more patrol cars screeched to a halt, their red and blue lights painting the quiet suburban street in chaos. What had started as a simple traffic stop 6 months ago was about to become the most explosive confrontation Riverside County had ever witnessed. Because when you mess with one member of the Iron Brotherhood, you mess with all 120 of them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in March when Jake Mitchell fired up his 1987 Harley-Davidson Softail in the driveway of his modest ranch house on Maple Street. The rumble of the engine echoed through the peaceful neighborhood where children rode bicycles and elderly couples tended their flower gardens. Jake had lived here for 12 years, ever since he'd married Sarah and traded his nomadic lifestyle for something resembling normalcy. At 42, Jake still carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen the darker corners of life but chose to walk in the light. His beard was neatly trimmed now, his leather vest hung in the closet more often than it graced his shoulders, and his knuckles bore the faded scars of a younger man's mistakes. He worked the night shift at Henderson Manufacturing, came home to help his daughter Emma with her homework, and spent weekends teaching her how to throw a curveball in the backyard. The Iron Brotherhood had been his family for over 2 decades, but Sarah and Emma were his world now. Still, loyalty ran deeper than marriage vows in his world, and when Brother Tommy called, saying he needed help moving his sick mother to a care facility across town, Jake didn't hesitate. Officer Derek Castellanos had been having a bad month. His wife had filed for divorce, his gambling debts were mounting, and internal affairs was breathing down his neck about excessive force complaints. At 34, he'd already developed the 1,000-yard stare of a cop who'd given up pretending he was one of the good guys. When he spotted the Harley approaching the intersection of Pine and 4th, something dark stirred in his chest. The bike's license plate was current. The rider wore a helmet. No traffic violations were evident. But Derek saw the Iron Brotherhood patch on the back of Jake's vest, and that was enough. In his mind, every biker was a criminal waiting to be caught, every leather-clad rider a threat to decent society. He flipped on his lights and pulled Jake over 3 blocks from the elementary school, where Emma would be dismissed in 4 hours. License and registration, Derek barked, before Jake had even fully stopped the engine. Jake complied without argument, his weathered hands steady as he reached for his wallet. He'd been through this dance before, knew that cooperation usually meant a quick ticket and everyone going about their day. But something felt different about this stop. The officer's hand rested on his service weapon. His jaw was clenched too tight, and his eyes held the kind of hostile intensity that Jake recognized from his younger, more violent days. Jake Mitchell, Derek read from the license, his voice dripping with contempt. Iron Brotherhood, huh? What kind of drugs are you carrying today, Mitchell? No drugs, officer. Just heading to help a friend move his mother. Derek's laugh was cold and humorless. Right, step off the bike. Heads where I can see them. What followed was 20 minutes of humiliation, orchestrated with bureaucratic precision. Derek searched every inch of the Harley, tore apart Jake's saddlebags, and made him stand spread-eagle against a chain-link fence while schoolchildren walked by on their way home. He found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. Jake Mitchell hadn't touched an illegal substance in 8 years, hadn't thrown a punch in anger in 6, and hadn't broken so much as a traffic law in 4. But Derek wasn't finished. As Jake bent to retrieve his scattered belongings, the officer's boot came down hard on his hand, grinding the knuckles into the asphalt. When Jake looked up in shock and pain, Derek's nightstick was already in motion, catching him across the ribs with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon. Resisting arrest, Derek announced to no one in particular, reaching for his handcuffs as Jake doubled over. Gasping for breath, The booking process at Riverside County Jail was a masterpiece of creative writing. According to the police report, Jake had been weaving erratically through traffic, reeked of alcohol, and became violent when approached by Officer Castellanos. The breathalyzer test that would have disproven the alcohol claim somehow malfunctioned. The dash cam that would have shown the truth had unfortunately experienced a technical error. And the three witnesses who'd seen the entire encounter from the bus stop across the street. Their statements were never taken. Sarah got the call at 3:17 p.m. just as she was leaving her job at the county clerk's office to pick up Emma from school. The voice on the other end was professionally neutral, offering no details beyond the address of the jail and visiting hours. When she arrived 2 hours later with Emma in tow, the desk sergeant treated her like she was already guilty of something by association. Jake's face told the real story. His left eye was swollen shut, purple bruises bloomed across his cheekbone, and he moved like every breath caused him pain. But it was the look in his good eye that worried Sarah most, not anger or fear, but a cold calculation that reminded her of the man he'd been before they met. "It's going to be okay," she whispered through the reinforced glass, pressing her palm against the window that separated them. Jake nodded, but they both knew it was a lie. In his world, there were rules that went deeper than law books and courtrooms. You protected your family, you stood by your brothers, and when someone crossed those lines, there were consequences that no judge or jury would ever understand. The bail hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 3 days away. Jake would spend those 72 hours in a cell with genuine criminals, men who would see his colors and either respect them or test them. Sarah would spend them making phone calls, hiring a lawyer they couldn't afford, and trying to explain to an 8-year-old girl why Daddy wasn't coming home. But neither of them spent those 3 days idle, because while Jake sat in his cell, word was spreading through a network that stretched from Los Angeles to Phoenix, from truck stops to tattoo parlors, from dive bars to suburban garages where middle-aged men still dreamed of the open road. The Iron Brotherhood was making calls. 230 miles away in Phoenix, Vincent Razor Delacroix was rebuilding a carburetor when his phone buzzed against the workbench. Grease-stained fingers swiped the screen, revealing a message that made his weathered face go stone cold. Razor had been Iron Brotherhood for 28 years, had watched Jake Mitchell evolve from a hot-headed prospect into one of the most respected members in 3 states. The words on his screen weren't just information, they were a declaration of war. Within minutes, Razor's garage fell silent except for the mechanical clicking of phone keypads. 7 members worked the local network while Razor handled the bigger picture. By 6 p.m., chapters from Tucson to Sacramento knew that Jake Mitchell was sitting in a cage, beaten and falsely charged by a badge-heavy coward named Derek Castellanos. The Iron Brotherhood operated on principles older than the Constitution and more binding than blood. Mess with one, mess with all. It wasn't a motto printed on T-shirts or painted on gas tanks. It was a sacred covenant that had kept them alive through decades of bar fights, police raids, and territorial wars with rival clubs. Meanwhile, in Riverside County, Detective Marcus Hawthorne was reviewing Derek's arrest report with growing unease. Hawthorne had 22 years on the force, had worked on everything from domestic disputes to homicide, and could smell a fabricated report from 3 desks away. The paperwork was too clean, the timeline too convenient, and Derek's explanation for the malfunctioning equipment felt rehearsed. But Hawthorne had bigger problems than one questionable arrest. Internal Affairs was already investigating 3 excessive force complaints against Derek, and the department couldn't afford another scandal. The last thing they needed was a civil rights lawsuit from some biker's family. Better to let the court sort it out and hope the whole thing disappeared into the plea bargain system. That calculation changed dramatically when Hawthorne's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. "Detective, this is dispatch. We've got reports of motorcycle activity throughout the county. Groups of 5 to 10 bikes, all moving toward the city center. No laws being broken, but the volume is Unusual. Hawthorne pulled up the traffic cameras on his computer. Even in the grainy night vision, the sight made his stomach tighten. Motorcycles moved through the darkness like schools of metallic fish, their headlights cutting through empty streets with military precision. They weren't speeding, weren't running lights, weren't giving patrol units any legal reason to stop them. But their destination was becoming clear with each passing hour. At the Sleepy Inn Motel on Highway 15, 23 Iron Brotherhood members from the San Bernardino chapter gathered in room 117. The space reeked of cigarettes and motor oil, while tactical discussions unfolded around a county map spread across the stained carpet. These weren't the weekend warriors who bought Harleys to feel dangerous during suburban rides. These were men who'd earned their patches through loyalty, courage, and a willingness to bleed for their brothers. Tommy Bulldog Harrison commanded respect through both his physical presence and his strategic mind. At 56, he'd survived 3 decades in a world where weakness was fatal and betrayal meant exile. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from a bar fight in Barstow that had ended with 2 men hospitalized and Tommy walking away. "Jake's bail hearing is tomorrow morning," Bulldog announced, his voice cutting through the cigarette haze. "We're not there to start trouble. We're there to show this county that Jake Mitchell has family, and family doesn't abandon each other." Similar conversations were happening in motel rooms, garage apartments, and truck stop parking lots across 5 states. The Iron Brotherhood's communication network operated without social media, without email trails that prosecutors could subpoena. Word traveled through personal phones, face-to-face meetings, and a system of trusted intermediaries who'd perfected the art of saying much while revealing little. By Thursday evening, Sarah Mitchell's phone was ringing constantly. Voices she didn't recognize offered support, legal funds, and something more ominous, assurances that justice would be served regardless of what happened in court. She appreciated the solidarity but feared where it might lead. Jake had left that violent world behind when Emma was born, and Sarah refused to let one corrupt cop drag them back into it. Emma sensed the tension, even though the adults tried to shield her. Her father had missed their nightly reading session, hadn't been there to help with her science project, and wasn't coming to her school play on Friday. When she asked why, Sarah's explanations felt inadequate and rehearsed. 8-year-olds understood fairness better than adults sometimes, and nothing about Daddy being in jail while bad people stayed free made sense. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Officer Derek Castellanos spent Thursday night at Murphy's Tavern, a cop bar where complaints about liberal judges and criminal coddling laws flowed as freely as the whiskey. His version of the Jake Mitchell arrest grew more heroic with each retelling, transforming a traffic stop into a dangerous drug bust that saved countless children from harm. His audience of fellow officers nodded and bought rounds, but several noticed inconsistencies in Derek's story that hadn't appeared in his written report. Detective Hawthorne wasn't drinking. He was studying traffic camera footage and motorcycle registration databases, trying to understand the scope of what was building around his quiet county. The Iron Brotherhood wasn't a local gang confined to one neighborhood or city. They were a brotherhood that spanned the entire Southwest, with connections reaching into Nevada, Colorado, and beyond. More disturbing were the criminal histories attached to many of the names on his growing list. These weren't accountants playing dress-up on weekends. They were men with convictions for assault, weapons charges, and conspiracy. Some had served time in federal prison. Others had simply never been caught for crimes that Hawthorne could only guess at, but the strangest discovery was how many had clean records going back several years. Men who'd once lived outside the law had somehow transitioned into legitimate jobs, stable families, and community involvement. It suggested an organization capable of evolution, of strategic thinking that went beyond simple revenge fantasies. Friday morning arrived grey and cold. with a wind that carried the scent of rain and something less identifiable, the electric tension that preceded thunderstorms and riots. Sarah Mitchell put on her best dress, braided Emma's hair, and drove toward the courthouse where Jake's bail hearing would determine their immediate future. She had no idea that 96 motorcycles were already positioned within a 5-mile radius of the building, their riders waiting for a signal that might never come, or might change everything. Judge Patricia Whitmore had presided over bail hearings for 18 years, but nothing in her experience prepared her for the scene outside Riverside County Courthouse at 8 a.m. Friday morning. The parking lot resembled a chrome and leather convention, with dozens of motorcycles arranged in perfect formation. Their riders stood in small groups, coffee cups steaming in the crisp morning air, conversations conducted in low, respectful tones that somehow felt more threatening than shouting would have been. Sarah Mitchell walked through this gauntlet of leather and steel, with Emma's small hand gripped tightly in hers. She recognized some faces from barbecues and charity rides Jake had dragged her to over the years, but others were strangers whose presence spoke to connections she'd never fully understood. These men nodded respectfully as she passed, their weathered faces softening when they noticed Emma's school backpack and nervous expression. "Ma'am," said a giant with a grey ponytail and arms covered in intricate tattoos. "Name's Diesel. Rode with Jake in the old days. Just want you to know, whatever happens in there, you and the little one are family to us." Inside the courthouse, prosecutor Amanda Reynolds was having the worst morning of her career. The Mitchell case should have been routine, another biker with a drug charge who'd plead out and disappear into the system. Instead, her office was fielding calls from reporters, civil rights attorneys, and someone claiming to represent the American Civil Liberties Union. Worse, she'd spent 2 hours reviewing Derek Castellanos' arrest report and found enough holes to drive a motorcycle through. The breathalyzer malfunction was suspicious. The dashcam failure was convenient, and the complete absence of witness, statements in a case that occurred at a busy intersection during school dismissal hours, was simply impossible to explain. Jake Mitchell entered the courtroom in Orange County jail scrubs, his face still bearing the colorful evidence of his encounter with Derek's nightstick. The sight sent a visible ripple through the gallery, where 24 Iron Brotherhood members sat in unprecedented silence. These men, who'd spent lifetimes perfecting the art of intimidation, had transformed themselves into respectful courtroom observers, their discipline more unnerving than any display of aggression. Public defender Lisa Chang had drawn the short straw on this case, expecting another quick plea bargain that would pad her monthly statistics. Instead, she found herself representing a man whose criminal record was remarkably clean for someone wearing Iron Brotherhood colors. No drug convictions, no violent felonies, just a handful of minor infractions from his 20s that suggested youthful stupidity rather than criminal intent. More surprising was Jake's demeanor during their brief consultation. He wasn't the snarling outlaw she'd expected, but a soft-spoken man whose primary concern was the impact of his arrest on his daughter's school life. When she mentioned the bikers filling the courthouse, Jake's expression tightened with what looked like genuine worry rather than satisfaction. "They shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "This isn't their fight." But it was too late for such distinctions. Judge Whitmore called the hearing to order, her gavel echoing through a courtroom charged with tension thick enough to taste. Prosecutor Reynolds stood to present the state's case, acutely aware that every word would be scrutinized by men whose justice system operated by very different rules. The charges sounded serious when read aloud. Driving under the influence, possession of narcotics, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. But Reynolds' presentation lacked conviction, her voice betraying doubts about the evidence she was required to defend. Defense attorney Chang took careful notes, already planning the motions that would dismantle this house of cards. Outside the courtroom, Detective Hawthorne was coordinating with sheriff's deputies and highway patrol units positioned throughout the county. Radio chatter reported motorcycle groups continuing to arrive from distant states, their numbers growing beyond anything local law enforcement could effectively monitor. The latest count put Iron Brotherhood presence at over 80 riders, with more streaming in along every major highway. Captain Robert Sterling had commanded the Riverside County Sheriff's Department for 12 years, navigating budget cuts, political pressure, and the delicate balance between public safety and civil liberties. The Mitchell situation presented a perfect storm of complications. Excessive force allegations against one of his officers, a potentially fabricated arrest report, and an armed motorcycle gang whose legal right to peaceful assembly couldn't be challenged without triggering a federal lawsuit. Sterling's phone buzzed with updates from patrol units positioned throughout the city. The bikers were following traffic laws with mathematical precision, their behavior so carefully controlled that it felt like psychological warfare. They knew that one violation, one excuse for mass arrests, could transform their show of solidarity into a genuine crisis. At Henderson Manufacturing, Jake's supervisor fielded calls from reporters asking about their employees' criminal activities. Co-workers who'd known Jake as a reliable night shift worker and devoted father struggled to reconcile those memories with the man described in news reports as a dangerous outlaw. Some defended him vocally, while others quietly distanced themselves from any association with motorcycle gangs and police investigations. Emma Mitchell sat in her third-grade classroom, trying to concentrate on math problems while whispers followed her through the hallways. Children repeated fragments of conversations they'd overheard at home, transforming her father into either a hero or a monster depending on their parents' perspectives. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had dealt with family crises before, but nothing involving this level of public attention and community division. The bail hearing stretched past its scheduled 30 minutes, as Judge Whitmore reviewed evidence that grew more questionable with each document. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Officer Castellanos' testimony, but the absence of supporting evidence was glaring. No drugs had been found despite an extensive search. No credible witnesses supported the claim of erratic driving. The alleged assault occurred only after Jake was already restrained and outnumbered. Defense Attorney Chang rose to address the court, her voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell has lived in this community for over a decade. He's employed, married, and has a young daughter attending local schools. The charges against him appear to be based on a single officer's testimony, unsupported by physical evidence or independent witnesses. We request bail be set at a reasonable amount commensurate with Mr. Mitchell's ties to the community and lack of flight risk." Outside, the motorcycle formation had expanded to fill 3 parking lots and spill onto adjacent streets. Local business owners watched nervously from their windows, uncertain whether the bikers represented protection or threat to their establishments. Some had encountered Iron Brotherhood members before, at charity events and community fundraisers, finding them surprisingly generous and respectful. Others knew them only through media portrayals that emphasized violence and criminality. The moment of decision was approaching, and everyone in the courtroom understood that Judge Whitmore's ruling would determine whether this situation remained a legal proceeding or transformed into something far more dangerous. Judge Whitmore's gavel struck the bench with finality that echoed through the packed courtroom. Bail is set at $50,000. The amount was reasonable given the charges, but it might as well have been $50 million for a family living paycheck to paycheck. Sarah's face went pale as the financial reality hit her like a physical blow. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, however, an envelope appeared on the defense table containing a cashier's check for the full amount. No signature, no return address, just the funds that would free Jake Mitchell from his cage. Lisa Chang had never encountered such swift financial support from the biker community, and she wondered what obligations might come attached to their generosity. Officer Derek Castellanos watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom, his confidence eroding with each question raised about his arrest report. The judge's pointed inquiries about missing evidence and malfunctioning equipment had transformed routine testimony into something resembling cross-examination. Worse, Internal Affairs investigator Karen Brooks was taking detailed notes from the front row, her presence a clear signal that Derek's problems extended far beyond this single case. The release paperwork took 3 hours to process, during which the motorcycle gathering outside had swollen to unprecedented proportions. Local news crews arrived to document what reporters were calling either a show of solidarity or a gang intimidation display, depending on their station's editorial perspective. Helicopter footage revealed the geometric precision of the bike formations, their organized presence suggesting military-level coordination. Jake emerged from the courthouse into a world transformed by chrome and leather. Men he'd ridden with decades ago stood beside strangers whose colors identified chapters from Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico. The sight both humbled and terrified him. This display of brotherhood was everything he'd once cherished about Iron Brotherhood culture, but it also represented everything he'd tried to leave behind for his daughter's sake. Jake. Tommy Bulldog Harrison's voice boomed across the courthouse steps. The embrace that followed spoke to friendships forged in fire and tested by time. "Brother, you look like hell, but you're still standing. That's what matters." The reunion was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Sterling, flanked by 6 deputies in full riot gear. The sight of so many armed officers facing dozens of bikers created a tableau that photographers captured from multiple angles. Images that would define public perception of the entire incident. "Gentlemen," Sterling's voice carried across the parking lot with practiced authority, "I appreciate your peaceful demonstration of support. However, the gathering has reached a size that requires permits we don't have on file. I need to ask you to disperse before this becomes a public safety issue." Bulldog stepped forward, his movement causing subtle shifts throughout the biker formation. "Captain, we're not causing trouble, just showing support for a brother who got railroaded by one of your officers. We'll leave when Jake's ready to leave." Meanwhile, investigative reporter Sandra Kim was making phone calls that would expose cracks in the official narrative. Her sources at the courthouse revealed disturbing patterns in Derek Castellanos' arrest record. A disproportionate number of incidents involving minorities, bikers, and anyone whose appearance suggested non-conformity. More damaging were the sealed complaints from fellow officers questioning Derek's methods and honesty. At Riverside General Hospital, emergency room physician Dr. Michael Torres was reviewing photographs of Jake's injuries taken during his booking. The pattern of bruising was inconsistent with the fall during arrest described in the police report. The contusions suggested systematic beating rather than accidental trauma, and Torres had seen enough assault victims to recognize the difference. Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a media storm she'd never wanted. Reporters thrust microphones at her face, demanding statements about her husband's criminal associates and their threatening display. Her only goal was getting Jake home to Emma, but the path to normalcy seemed blocked by cameras, questions, and the growing realization that their quiet life had ended the moment Derek Castellanos decided to make Jake his personal target. Emma waited at her grandmother's house, watching news coverage that painted her father as either a victim or a villain depending on the channel. The 8-year-old's understanding of justice was simple. Bad people should be punished, good people should be protected, and grown-ups should make sure children felt safe. None of those principles seemed to be working in her world anymore. Back at the police station, Detective Hawthorne was discovering just how deep Derek's problems ran. A review of evidence locker records revealed discrepancies in drug seizures, suggesting that confiscated narcotics weren't always making it to trial. Witness statements from previous arrests showed troubling patterns of coercion and threats. Most damning was Derek's own body camera footage from recent months, which revealed a man increasingly out of control. The Iron Brotherhood leadership gathered at Murphy's Diner, 3 miles from the courthouse, to discuss their next moves. The bail money had been just the beginning. They'd hired private investigators, retained civil rights attorneys, and started documenting every aspect of Derek's career. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, delivered through legal channels that Derek couldn't manipulate or escape. But not everyone in the Brotherhood shared that patience. Younger members, men whose scars came from recent battles rather than old wars, whispered about more direct solutions. The tension between old-school diplomacy and new-school violence crackled. Through their conversations like electricity before a storm, Jake finally broke free from the media, circus, and climbed onto his recovered Harley, its engine purring with mechanical reliability that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding him. The ride to his mother-in-law's house would take him past 3 dozen Iron Brotherhood bikes, their riders forming an honor guard he'd never requested but couldn't refuse. As the sun set over Riverside County, the true battle was just beginning. Derek Castellanos might have won the first round, but he'd awakened forces that operated by rules he didn't understand. The question wasn't whether justice would be served, but whether it would come through courtrooms or through methods that no judge could control. The motorcycles began their engines in perfect synchronization, their collective roar announcing that the Iron Brotherhood's business in Riverside County was far from finished. The anonymous tip came into Sandra Kim's newsroom at 2:47 a.m. Monday morning. A gravelly voice, obviously disguised, provided specific details about evidence tampering in the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. The caller knew about Derek Castellanos' gambling debts, his connection to a bookmaker named Sal Martinez, and most damaging of all, a storage unit rented under a false name where confiscated drugs never made it to the evidence room. Sandra had built her investigative career on following such breadcrumbs, but this felt different. Someone inside the department was feeding her information that could destroy careers and trigger federal investigations. The question was whether her source wanted justice or revenge, and whether those goals were mutually exclusive in this case. At Henderson Manufacturing, Jake reported for his first night shift since the arrest. The loading dock fell silent as he walked through, some co-workers offering supportive nods while others turned away with obvious discomfort. Supervisor Frank Delancey called him into the office, his expression grim behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Jake, I've got to ask. This business with the police, the bikers at the courthouse, is my facility going to become a target? I've got 73 employees to think about, families depending on these jobs." The question stung because Jake understood its legitimacy. His past was colliding with his present in ways that threatened innocent people. "Frank, I've worked here 6 years without a single incident. Whatever's happening with that cop, it's not going to touch this place." "You have my word," but words felt inadequate when measured against the forces he'd unleashed. The Iron Brotherhood's commitment to justice came with a price that Jake was only beginning to understand. 40 miles away, Derek Castellanos sat in his studio apartment, surrounded by empty beer bottles and overdue bills. The Internal Affairs investigation had placed him on administrative leave, cutting his income in half while his gambling debts continued to compound. Sal Martinez wasn't known for patience with delinquent customers, and Derek's badge offered no protection in that particular world. The knock on his door came at 3:15 a.m., soft but insistent. Through the peephole, Derek saw 2 men in expensive suits who definitely weren't cops. Sal's enforcers had arrived to collect, and Derek's service weapon felt inadequate against the kind of violence they represented. "Officer Castellanos," the larger man said when Derek cracked the door open. "Mr. Martinez would like to discuss your account in person tonight." Dr. Michael Torres had spent Sunday reviewing Jake Mitchell's medical photographs with a forensic pathologist from the county coroner's office. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The injuries were consistent with systematic beating by someone trained in inflicting maximum pain without causing permanent damage. The pattern suggested law enforcement or military experience, knowledge of how to hurt someone while maintaining plausible deniability. Torres had testified in police brutality cases before, had seen how the system protected its own through procedural delays and evidence mysteriously going missing. But the Mitchell case felt different. The media attention, the biker presence, and the growing list of Derek's questionable arrests created momentum that might actually produce accountability. Emma Mitchell returned to school Monday morning to find her locker decorated with crayon drawings from classmates. Some showed motorcycles and helmets. Others depicted police cars and jail cells, all filtered through 8-year-old perspectives on good guys and bad guys. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had spent the weekend preparing lessons about fairness, justice, and how sometimes grown-ups made mistakes that affected entire families. The conversation was interrupted by Principal Davidson's announcement over the intercom. "Teachers, please implement Security Protocol Blue immediately." The coded message meant potential threat to campus, and within minutes, all exterior doors were locked, while administrators scanned the parking lot for unusual activity. The source of concern was a single motorcycle parked across the street, its rider simply standing beside it without obvious threat. But in the current climate, any Iron Brotherhood presence near the school triggered heightened security responses that transformed Emma's educational environment into something resembling a prison lockdown. At the courthouse, defense attorney Lisa Chang was building a case that extended far beyond Jake Mitchell's innocence. Her private investigator had uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning Derek's entire career, planted evidence, falsified reports, and witness intimidation that painted a picture of systematic corruption. More disturbing were the connections between Derek's arrest, patterns and unsolved cases where evidence had conveniently disappeared. Judge Whitmore received an unusual request that afternoon. The FBI wanted to review all cases involving Derek Castellanos for the past 3 years. Agent Rebecca Foster's credentials suggested federal interest in more than simple police brutality. Drug trafficking, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations fell under federal jurisdiction, and Derek's activities apparently qualified on all counts. The Iron Brotherhood's legal strategy was bearing fruit through channels that surprised even their most experienced members. Decades of operating outside the law had taught them which rules actually mattered and which were merely suggestions. Now they were using that knowledge to dismantle Derek's career through the same system he'd tried to manipulate. But patience wasn't universal within their ranks. Marcus Sledge Romano had driven 18 hours from Albuquerque with vengeance on his mind, rather than justice in his heart. At 28, Sledge represented a newer generation of Iron Brotherhood members whose solutions involved fists and firearms rather than lawyers and lawsuits. His arrival at Murphy's Diner created immediate tension among the established leadership. "This legal bullshit is taking too long," Sledge announced to the gathered brothers. "That pig beat Jake in broad daylight and he's still walking around free. Where I come from, we handle disrespect more directly." Bulldog Harrison's response was swift and final. "Where you come from doesn't matter here, boy. This is Jake's fight, and he gets to choose how it's fought. We're not outlaws anymore, we're citizens, demanding justice through proper channels." The philosophical divide within the Iron Brotherhood reflected broader tensions about their evolution from outlaw gang to something approaching legitimate organization. Some members had families, businesses, and reputations to protect. Others clung to older traditions, where respect was earned through violence and maintained through fear. Derek Castellanos understood none of these nuances as he sat in the back of Sal Martinez's Cadillac, watching familiar streets pass by like scenes from someone else's life. The bookmaker wanted his money, the bikers wanted his blood, and internal affairs wanted his badge. For the first time since putting on a uniform, Derek realized that his problems might have solutions that no amount of violence could provide. The meeting location was a warehouse in the industrial district where screams wouldn't attract attention and blood could be hosed away without leaving evidence. Derek's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, then stopped as he remembered it had been confiscated pending the investigation. He was completely defenseless for the first time in his adult life. The warehouse smelled of motor oil and desperation. Derek Castellanos sat in a metal folding chair while Sal Martinez's men positioned themselves with practiced efficiency. These weren't street thugs, but professionals who understood the mathematics of pain and the economics of fear. Derek's 17 years of police experience felt worthless in this concrete box, where badges carried no authority. $47,000, Sal announced, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. Plus interest, plus inconvenience fees. My associates tell me you've been avoiding their calls. Derek's throat felt like sandpaper. I'm good for it, Sal. The suspension is temporary. Once this biker thing blows over, but that's the problem, isn't it? Sal interrupted, consulting a tablet that glowed eerily in the warehouse gloom. My sources suggest the biker thing isn't blowing over. In fact, it appears to be expanding in ways that could affect your long-term earning potential. Outside the warehouse, Agent Rebecca Foster was coordinating a federal task force that had been building cases against corrupt law enforcement for 18 months. Derek Castellanos had appeared on their radar 6 months ago through financial irregularities that suggested money laundering or evidence skimming. The Jake Mitchell incident had accelerated their timeline, providing the public scrutiny needed to justify federal intervention. Foster's team included specialists from the DEA, FBI Financial Crimes Division, and Civil Rights Division. They'd identified at least 12 cases where Derek's arrests had resulted in evidence disappearing before trial, drugs vanishing from evidence lockers, and witnesses suddenly becoming uncooperative. The pattern suggested systematic corruption that extended beyond one rogue officer. At Riverside County Sheriff's Department, Captain Sterling faced the worst crisis of his career. Internal Affairs investigator Karen Brooks had presented him with evidence that Derek's misconduct went back years, involving planted evidence, falsified reports, and connections to organized crime through gambling debts. Worse, 3 other officers showed similar patterns, suggesting departmental culture that enabled rather than prevented corruption. The political implications were staggering. Federal oversight, civil rights lawsuits, and media scrutiny could destroy careers that had taken decades to build. Sterling understood that sacrificing Derek might save the department, but protecting him would doom everyone involved. Jake Mitchell spent Tuesday evening teaching Emma how to change a bicycle tire, their garage providing refuge from the media attention that continued to surround their family. The simple act of turning wrenches and explaining gear ratios felt like salvation after days of lawyers, reporters, and questions about a world he tried to leave behind. "Daddy, why do the kids at school say you're a bad guy?" Emma asked, her small hands struggling with a stubborn bolt. The question pierced Jake's heart more effectively than any police baton. "Some people think that because I have friends who ride motorcycles, that makes me dangerous. But you know me, sweetheart. Do I seem dangerous to you?" Emma considered this with 8-year-old seriousness. "You're scary when you're mad, but you're never mad at me or Mommy, just people who hurt our family." Her innocent observation contained wisdom that Jake wished more adults possessed. The Iron Brotherhood's presence in Riverside County wasn't about intimidation or revenge. It was about protecting family when official systems failed to provide justice. That protection took tangible form Tuesday night when Sarah's car broke down on Highway 74. Within minutes of her roadside assistance call, 2 Iron Brotherhood members appeared with tools and expertise. They changed her tire, checked her oil, and followed her home to ensure safe arrival. No payment was requested or accepted, just the quiet efficiency of family taking care of family. At Murphy's Diner, The Brotherhood's leadership was planning their next phase. Legal channels were producing results, but slowly. Derek remained free pending investigation, his badge suspended but his capacity for retaliation intact. More concerning were reports of other officers with similar patterns, suggesting corruption that extended beyond one individual. "We've got federal attention now," Bulldog reported to the assembled chapter presidents. "FBI, DEA, Civil Rights Division. They're building cases that could send Derek and his buddies to federal prison for decades." The news should have been satisfying, but it carried complications. Federal investigations moved slowly, required extensive evidence, and offered no guarantee of convictions. Meanwhile, Derek's gambling debts were creating pressures that could lead to desperate actions by a man with nothing left to lose. Sandra Kim's investigation was revealing connections that explained Derek's transformation from marginally competent officer to actively corrupt one. Financial records showed gambling losses escalating 3 years ago, followed by evidence irregularities and arrest patterns that suggested drug theft and resale. Derek hadn't just been stealing evidence, he'd been working as a middleman between street dealers and upscale customers who paid premium prices for clean narcotics. The scope of the conspiracy was broader than anyone had imagined. Drug seizures that never made it to trial, evidence that disappeared from secure lockers, arrest reports that painted guilt where innocence existed and innocence where guilt thrived. Derek hadn't been operating alone, but as part of a network that included other officers, courthouse personnel, and criminal organizations that paid for protection and information. Dr. Torres received an unexpected visitor Wednesday morning, FBI agent Foster, requesting his expert opinion on police brutality patterns throughout the county. The medical evidence from Jake's case was compelling, but it represented just one incident in what appeared to be systematic abuse of power. "Doctor, we're seeing patterns that suggest trained techniques for inflicting pain without leaving permanent evidence," Foster explained. "Military or law enforcement training used for criminal purposes. Your expertise could help us identify other victims who might be afraid to come forward." The conversation was interrupted by Foster's radio, crackling with urgent updates. Derek Castellanos had missed his scheduled check-in with Internal Affairs. His apartment was empty, his service vehicle abandoned at a truck stop 20 miles outside town. Either he'd fled the state or something worse had happened to him. The Iron Brotherhood's radio network came alive with reports of increased police activity throughout the county. Helicopters circled the warehouse district, while tactical teams moved with purpose that suggested more than routine patrols. Something significant was happening, and Derek's disappearance might be connected to forces beyond their control or understanding. Marcus "Sledge" Romano watched the police activity from his position outside town, his hand resting on weapons that federal agents would find very interesting. The younger generation of Iron Brotherhood members understood patience less well than their elders, and Derek's vanishing act felt like escape rather than justice. But Derek wasn't escaping anything in Sal Martinez's warehouse. He was learning that gambling debts were collected through methods that made police brutality seem gentle by comparison. The convoy began forming at dawn Thursday morning, but not where anyone expected. Instead of gathering at the courthouse or police station, 120 motorcycles assembled in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Cemetery, their chrome reflecting the morning sun like a metallic river flowing between marble headstones. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Iron Brotherhood had come to honor the dead, both literal and metaphorical, while preparing to defend the living. Jake Mitchell received the call at 5:43 a.m. from Bulldog Harrison, whose voice carried the weight of inevitability. "Brother, we tried to let the system work, but sometimes the system needs help remembering what justice looks like. We're not here to start trouble, we're here to finish it. Bulldog, I appreciate everything you've done, but Emma's already been through enough. This escalation could put my family in danger. Jake, your family's already in danger. Derek's missing. probably dead or dying, and his corrupt buddies are scrambling to cover their tracks. You think they're going to leave loose ends like witness testimony lying around? This ends today, one way or another. The truth in those words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been naive to think Derek's disappearance meant the end of their troubles. In a world where corruption ran deep enough to involve multiple officers and civilian accomplices, the Mitchell family represented a threat that needed elimination. At the warehouse, Derek Castellanos was experiencing what Sal Martinez called educational therapy, lessons in financial responsibility delivered through increasingly creative applications of pain. Derek's police training had covered suspect interrogation, but nothing about resisting professional torture administered by men who'd perfected their craft through decades of collecting debts from reluctant customers. The beautiful thing about cops, Sal explained while examining a car battery and jumper cables, is that you're trained to break people psychologically, but rarely prepared for physical breakdown yourselves. Creates interesting learning opportunities. Derek's radio continued broadcasting search updates, his fellow officers unaware that their missing colleague was learning firsthand about the criminal organizations he'd been protecting through evidence tampering and selective enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on Sal's associates, who'd been paying Derek for protection that had evaporated the moment his gambling debts exceeded his usefulness. Agent Foster's command center had transformed into something resembling a war room, with federal agents, state investigators, and select local officers coordinating the largest corruption investigation in county history. Surveillance footage, financial records, and intercepted communications painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that extended far beyond Derek's individual misconduct. "We're looking at RICO potential here," Foster announced to her assembled team. "Ongoing criminal enterprise involving law enforcement, courthouse personnel, and organized crime." Derek's disappearance could be witness elimination or internal conflict over territory and profits. Either way, we need him alive. The investigation had revealed connections that shocked even veteran federal agents. Evidence from Derek's cases had been systematically diverted to black market sales networks. Arrest patterns showed protection services for drug dealers who paid premium rates for advance warning of raids. Most disturbing were the witness intimidation cases where Derek's reports described cooperation that victims later denied. Providing, Captain Sterling faced the assembled media outside the police station while 120 motorcycles formed geometric patterns in the background like a leather-clad army at parade rest. The visual contrast between his pressed uniform and their weathered leather created imagery that photographers captured from multiple angles, pictures that would define public perception of law enforcement credibility. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department is cooperating fully with federal investigators, Sterling announced, his voice barely audible over helicopter rotors and motorcycle engines idling in perfect synchronization. Officer Castellanos remains suspended pending investigation. His current whereabouts are unknown, and we're treating his disappearance as a potential crime rather than flight from prosecution. Questions erupted from reporters who'd spent days uncovering connections between Derek's gambling debts, evidence tampering, and organized crime influence within the department. "Captain, how many officers are involved in this corruption network? What about reports of evidence disappearing from secure lockers? Are you concerned that the biker presence represents vigilante justice?" Sterling's responses were carefully crafted by department lawyers to acknowledge problems while protecting ongoing investigations. But his words felt inadequate against the backdrop of iron Brotherhood discipline that communicated volumes without speaking. These men had traveled hundreds of miles, not for violence, but for visibility, their presence ensuring that Derek's case couldn't be quietly buried through administrative procedures. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching news helicopters circle overhead while Emma ate breakfast and prepared for another day of school-turned-security zone. The media attention had transformed their neighborhood into a fishbowl where every movement was recorded and analyzed by strangers seeking narratives that fit predetermined storylines about motorcycle gangs and police corruption. "Mommy, why do the helicopters keep flying over our house?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old curiosity cutting through adult attempts to normalize abnormal circumstances. "Because sometimes, when grown-ups make mistakes, other grown-ups want to write stories about it," Sarah replied, struggling to explain media dynamics to someone whose understanding of fairness was still beautifully simple. The call came at 2:47 p.m. Derek's voice barely recognizable through pain-induced distortion as he whispered coordinates that Agent Foster's tech team triangulated within minutes. The warehouse address matched properties owned by shell companies connected to Sal Martinez's criminal network, locations that had been under federal surveillance for months without revealing their true purpose. Foster's tactical response was coordinated perfection involving federal agents, sheriff's deputies, state police, and specialized rescue units. Helicopters provided aerial surveillance while ground teams surrounded the warehouse complex through carefully planned approach routes that minimized civilian exposure and maximized tactical advantage. The Iron Brotherhood formation outside the police station received radio updates about the warehouse operation through their own communication network, information flowing between chapters with efficiency that impressed even federal observers. These men understood coordination and discipline through decades of operating in hostile environments where survival depended on reliable intelligence and mutual support. Marcus Sledge. Romano monitored police frequencies from his position outside town. Weapons cache prepared for contingencies that older Brotherhood members hoped wouldn't become necessary. The generational divide within Iron Brotherhood culture was evident. Veterans who'd learned to work within legal systems versus younger members who still believed in direct action solutions. Bulldog. If Derek's dead when they find him, this investigation dies with him, Sledge radioed. His corrupt buddies walk free, and Jake's family remains targets for elimination. Maybe it's time to handle this the old way. Bulldog's response was immediate and final. Stand down, Sledge. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about justice. And justice works better when it comes through courtrooms instead of graveyards. The warehouse assault lasted 11 minutes of controlled violence that demonstrated why federal tactical teams trained for months before attempting such operations. Sal Martinez's security had prepared for police raids but not coordinated federal task force operations involving multiple agencies with overlapping jurisdictions and specialized equipment. Derek emerged on a medical stretcher, alive but requiring immediate hospital intervention for injuries that told the story of professional torture administered by experts in pain management. His survival represented more than personal victory. It meant the corruption investigation would have a living witness whose testimony could dismantle criminal networks. Spanning multiple counties, Dr. Torres received Derek at Riverside General Hospital with the same clinical professionalism he'd shown while documenting Jake Mitchell's injuries weeks earlier. The medical evidence would prove equally damaging in federal court. But these injuries told a different story: systematic torture rather than impulsive brutality, criminal enterprise rather than individual misconduct. Agent Foster, Dr. Torres reported after initial examination. Mr. Castellanos has sustained injuries consistent with prolonged torture involving electrical stimulation, controlled burns, and systematic joint manipulation. Whoever did this knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain without causing death. The medical documentation became crucial, evidence in federal prosecutions that would eventually reach across 3 states and involve 24 defendants. Derek's cooperation, purchased through plea agreements that spared him life imprisonment, resulted in convictions that sent 12 officers and 6 civilian accomplices to federal prison for terms ranging from 8 to 25 years. The Iron Brotherhood began their exodus Thursday evening, engines roaring to life in synchronized crescendo that echoed through the valley like thunder announcing the end of a storm. Their demonstration of solidarity had achieved its purpose, not through violence, but through visible unity. Their presence helping focus national attention on corruption that local authorities would have preferred to handle quietly. Jake Mitchell watched them leave from his front porch, Emma beside him waving at departing riders who'd become temporary guardian angels for their family. Some honked their horns in response, others raised gloved hands in farewell gestures that spoke to connections transcending geography and circumstance. "Will we see them again, Daddy?" Emma asked as the last motorcycle disappeared around the corner. "Probably not, sweetheart. They have their own families to go home to now. But if we ever need them again, they'll come." 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles hosted trials that made national news for their scope and implications. Derek Castellanos testified from witness protection about systematic corruption that had infected Riverside County's law enforcement for years. His cooperation resulting in convictions that dismantled criminal networks extending across state lines. Jake Mitchell returned to work at Henderson Manufacturing, his reputation restored through legal vindication rather than violent retribution. Co-workers who'd once whispered about his criminal associates now spoke respectfully about his courage in facing down corrupt law enforcement. The experience had taught everyone involved lessons about judging people by appearances rather than actions. Emma's school implemented comprehensive anti-bullying programs after her experience with guilt by association harassment became a case study in how criminal justice controversies affect innocent family members. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, developed a curriculum about fairness, justice, and the importance of supporting classmates facing difficult circumstances beyond their control. Sarah started a support group for families affected by police misconduct, channeling their trauma into advocacy for others facing similar injustices. The organization grew to include families from across California, providing legal resources, emotional support, and political advocacy for criminal justice reform that protected both law enforcement integrity and citizen rights. Agent Foster received federal commendation for investigations that became models for addressing systematic law enforcement corruption. The Riverside County case demonstrated how federal intervention could dismantle criminal networks when sufficient evidence was gathered and appropriate. Pressure was applied through legal channels, and in a quiet ranch house on Maple Street, a father taught his daughter that sometimes the scariest-looking people were actually the gentlest protectors. While people wearing badges weren't always trustworthy authorities, it was a lesson worth learning, even if it came at a price none of them had wanted to. The Iron Brotherhood returned to their home states carrying stories of how justice sometimes required showing up in overwhelming numbers without throwing a single punch. Their disciplined solidarity had helped focus national attention on problems that might otherwise have been buried through bureaucratic procedures, proving that organized citizen action could achieve results when legal systems needed encouragement to function properly. The final lesson belonged to Emma Mitchell, who learned that families came in many forms, some connected by blood, others by choice, and still others by shared commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was wisdom that would serve her well in a world where justice often required courage from unexpected sources. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.